Hello, everyone. Today we're going to start sort of our new unit. We are still in Unit 3, but we're going to be dealing with imaginary and complex numbers. So today our essential question is, how do you perform operations on complex numbers? And by the end of the week, you should be able to perform operations with complex numbers by adding, subtracting, and multiplying. So before we get into what complex numbers are, we need to do an introduction to imaginary numbers, okay? So imaginary numbers, we denote imaginary numbers using this fancy little I here. And it represents an imaginary number where I is the square root of a -1. So remember, hopefully you remember back in Algebra 1, anytime we had like the square root of -5, we always just wrote no real solution. Yes, no real solution. And so that way we just left it like that. But now that we're in Algebra 2, we're going to be talking about these new kinds of numbers, and they are called real numbers. And that's anytime we have a negative inside of a square root. And so if we had an I squared, that would actually just be the number -1, because if we have the I squared, which we know is the square root of -1, and if we just took that and we squared it, the square root and squared are inverses of each other, so they cancel each other out, and we end up just having a -1. And so here is also a way to simplify expressions with I. If you have something written like this, the square root of -r, you can go ahead and separate it to the square root of -1 times the square root of r. So you would just write it I square roots of r. So if, for example, we wanted to simplify this, we would do the square root of -1 times the square root of 5. We know that the square root of -1 is just I, so it'd be I square roots of 5. And so we're going to get into that a little bit more in our next couple examples. All right, so here is example 1. We have the square root of -75. So depending on who your Algebra 1 teacher is, but I always taught this using the factor tree. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to separate this to just the square root of -1 times the square root of 75. And then we're going to take that 75 and we're going to break it down. So I always go, what's the first thing that pops into your head that divides into 75? So I know that it's 25 and 3 because 75 cents is 3/4. And then you can break down the 25 into 5 and 5. And so remember, when you're simplifying square roots, when we have the same number on the inside becomes 1 on the outside. So this would be the square root of -1. 2 on the inside becomes just 1 on the outside. So these two 5s becomes just a regular 5. And then we have the square root of 3 left over. So don't use that 25 because we broke it down into our, I don't know how that happened. I'm just going to leave it. So we're not using the 25 because we broke it into 5 and 5. And we know that the square root of -1 is just I. So we're going to go ahead. So this whole thing becomes that imaginary I. So your final answer is going to be, we write 5I. Ooh, that's awful. We write 5I, and then we write that square root of 3. So that would be it simplified. 5I square roots of 3. And the only reason why we're doing this is because when we actually do quadratics, you're going to have to deal with imaginary numbers. And so we're just kind of doing some basic review. So do me a favor. Let me do example 2, and then I have you try example 3. So let's do one more example. And so here's my little memory device. So anytime we have a negative inside of a square root, I want you to just pluck out your I. So you know there's going to be an I. Anytime you have a negative inside of that square root, you just pluck out your I. And then we're going to have that square root of 28 still in there. And then we're going to break it down into, the first thing that pops into my head is 2 and 14. Then the 14 can break down into 2 and 7. Remember, 2 inside the square root is just 1 on the outside. So we're going to have just a 2. And then we're going to have that square root of 7. And don't forget to pluck out your I. Sorry, I kind of wrote it a little small there. So pluck out your I. Pluck out your I. And that's how you would simplify it. All right, so this one should be nice and easy. Everyone knows what the square root of 36 is. So the square root of 36 is just 6. And don't forget to pluck out your I. So it's going to be just 6i. All right, so go ahead, and I want you to try these 4 problems on your own. Give it a shot, and then I'll go over it in a little bit. But please pause the video, try this yourself, and then unpause it to see if you did it right. All right, here we go. So first thing you want to do is notice there's a negative inside of the square root. You know that's going to be an imaginary number, so you need to pluck out your I. And then you have the square root of 50. Break it down. The first thing that pops into my head is 5 and 10. 10 breaks down into 5 and 2. Which one's a twin? That 5 is a twin, so 1 on the outside. We're going to write our I, and then the one that is not a twin is that 2, so we're going to write it square root of 2. All right, so this one, you're going to pluck out your I because there's a negative inside of that square root. Pluck out your I. And then we're going to take that square root of 20, break it down, 2 and 10. 10 is 2 and 5. We have twin 2's. 2's are twins. Take one out. Don't forget to write your I. And then what is our loner that does not have a twin? That is that 5, so it's going to be square root of 5. All right, so a couple more. We're going to have the square root of 12. Don't forget to pluck out your I. Anytime you have a negative in a square root, you know you're going to have an I. And then you're going to break down that 12 into 4 and 3, or you could have done 2 and 6, either one. And then 4 breaks into 2 and 2. The 2 is a twin. Write your I. And then our loner that does not have a twin is 3, square root of 3. And this one should be super easy. What's the square root of 100? Everyone knows that's just 10. Don't forget, since we have a negative in there, you got to pluck out your I. So it's 10i. Right, so we're just kind of doing a little bit of review from simplifying radicals, and now we're just adding that imaginary number I involved. So stay tuned for the next video where we actually start adding and subtracting these imaginary numbers and complex numbers. Thanks for watching.